Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video where we're taking a look at interesting shotguns. Now, today's video isn't in our long recoil series, it's not in our gas-operated series, and it's not in our inertia-operated series. It's not really in its own series at all. This is a short recoil operated shotgun, and the particular short recoil mechanism that it uses is pretty darn interesting and has a sort of cool story to go along with it. Today's shotguns are none other than the Winchester Model 50 and sort of the follow-on slash improvement slash version of it, the Winchester Model 59. Now, for a little bit of historical background, the Model 50 name of the Model 50 is a little deceiving. The Model 50 was actually introduced in 1954, not in 1950 as some people sort of tend to assume because of the name. The Model 59, however, was introduced in 59, so that's sort of a tricky thing to have to keep track of, as we have 54 and 59 for the 50 and 59 respectively. Now, we've previously talked about Winchester's automatics that came before the Model 50 and Model 59. They weren't great, right? The Winchester 1911 gets a very bad reputation. I think it gets a bad reputation for the wrong reasons, because there are actually quite a few even, redeeming things about the gun in general, but it was not that great of a commercial success. I mean, a decent number of them were actually made considering what it is, and they made them for a pretty decent span of years. But Winchester sought to improve that with the Model 40. But the Model 40 was rushed into production. It really wasn't quite ready whenever it hit store shelves, and it had its own slew of issues, mostly to do with the quality and the design of the thing. So the Model 40 likewise saw even smaller production and was pulled from production even sooner. Thus was probably even a bigger failure than the Winchester 1911 barrel cocking shotgun. Thus, after World War II, Winchester was still interested in getting into the automatic shotgun game, but they knew that they were probably going to have to change up their approach a little bit. As a reminder, at this point in history, pretty much all automatic shotguns that had any modicum of success were long recoil operated, but in those post-World War II years, everybody sort of scattered in the shotgun world to try and find some way to improve it. Of course, we saw an explosion of Italian and then later Japanese companies try to get interested and hands-on with making their own automatic shotguns to sell in the American market. And Winchester, at this point, realizes this is not a market that they should give up. So through the late 1940s, they're trying to come up with an improved version of the Model 40, is where they sort of start out, is okay, the Model 40 had some good ideas, what if we can just try and make it better? Now, Winchester would have Ed Browning take a lot of passes at making an improved Model 40, and there's a couple of technical drawings out there floating on the internet of sort of like pre-prototype wood mock-ups of what an improved Model 40 would have looked like that Winchester put together. Initially, they were sort of looking at a short recoil operated shotgun that had an accelerator lever on the bottom of the receiver to try and punt the bolt back a little faster, and just used a very short stroking barrel to accomplish that. However, they eventually found that that lever was probably unnecessary and just the short stroke of the barrel could accomplish what they needed. However, through the course of World War II, Winchester would end up coming into contact with a gun designer known as David Marshall Williams. Now, he's sort of infamous slash famous in his own right for his involvement in the carbine. In fact, his name in American lore is Carbine Williams because of a sort of often understood relationship that he had with the M1 carbine firearm, where he sort of came up with a design for a gas system that the carbine ended up using, but most of the rest of his design for the carbine wasn't used, so maybe Gas Tappet Williams would be a more apt name for the guy with regards to his involvement with the carbine. But after World War II, of course, he was still very interested in the gun space, right? This is where he's famous. And Winchester sort of being the company that brought the M1 carbine that we know to the forefront, right, them winning that contract, if you will, meant that Winchester and Williams sort of had something of a special relationship. So as Winchester is going through and looking, how can we improve this shotgun, Williams brings up a design that he had had as an early concept while he was thinking about, carbine-y things, which is that of a floating chamber. So it's a recoil-operated firearm, although sort of one of the drawbacks of a recoil-operated firearm, if you will, is that ordinarily the entire barrel needs to reciprocate. Well, on a shotgun, the barrel can be pretty long and ungainly, and now you have to support the barrel because it's so long, you have to support it against the magazine tube or something to prevent the barrel from sort of trying to twist and bind up as it's reciprocating. Williams' idea was pretty simple. Why don't we just make the bare minimum of the barrel reciprocate? So why don't we just have a chamber, and the chamber reciprocates. The chamber has a locking feature in it that the bolt locks to. The chamber reciprocates, stops, and then the bolt continues backwards. In this regard, it's sort of like taking just the chamber section of a pistol barrel and having it rotate with the slide in a Browning tilting action instead of having the rest of the barrel come with it. It's a very interesting system that in a lot of pistols or rifles, rifled guns in general, wouldn't make a lot of sense because having your chamber move independently of the rest of your barrel starts to introduce some questions about accuracy and repeatability of that lockup. But in the case of shotguns, much like with long recoil and traditional short recoil operated shotguns, it's genius because that little bit of wiggle, that little bit of inconsistency in lockup is well within the margin of error of one shot to the next in terms of the actual dispersion of the shot that you're firing from a shotgun. Now, as the story goes, Winchester would be working with Williams. Williams would take prototypes of the gun that would become the Model 50 out to shoot, and he'd end up marking places on the bolt and how its operating parts fit together against the receiver, sort of marking them with machinist's blue. I guess whatever they called machinist blue back then, it might have been machinist blue, but he would put markings on the parts to see that when the gun cycled, it would rub those markings off, and he'd know that material is high here and needs to be removed, and he sort of tweaked his design this way rather than sitting there and iterating on paper. He had the physical prototype in his hands, tweaked the prototype until it was where he wanted, and then said we should make them all like that, which I think is a sort of interesting way. Maybe you could look at this as saying, well, you're designing the gun backwards, but I think it's a sort of cool way for the gun to come into existence. Now, like we mentioned, in 1954, Winchester would introduce the Model 50. It received decent commercial praise. A lot of people were very interested to have something that wasn't just the same old long recoil system, so it was exciting that you could have that. The way Winchester chose to sort of market and configure these guns was a 3-shot automatic. Of course, for hunting by this point in time, you had to only have 3 rounds in your gun for federally to shoot any sort of migratory bird. Most states also had a similar law where it was 3-round total capacity for any sort of hunting you're going to do. So Winchester saw 3 rounds isn't really a drawback for an automatic. Really what you're getting is a gun that's a little bit more trim because, in the case of most people at this point in time, right, these days we don't really look at it this way, but back then, shotguns were the most popular firearm. And the reason people were buying them was for hunting, if not just for clay shooting. In clay shooting, we've talked about this before multiple times, you really only need 1 or 2 shells at a time as far as the regulations and rules for the various games you're playing. And for hunting, like we just explained, you really only would need 3 rounds at most. So Winchester was really trying to cater to what people in the gun buying public were really interested in. Of course, the Auto 5 was designed so long ago, these laws didn't really exist. And Browning had even investigated, through FN, making 3-shot specific versions of the Auto 5 because a lot of consumers were very interested in, I don't want to have to mess around with plugs or reducing capacity or any of that. I just want a gun that I can take anywhere, 50 states, and be completely legal to hunt with and not have to worry about, did I forget a plug? Do I have a plug? Do I need a plug? These sorts of things. So that was sort of Winchester's intent behind making it a 3-shot automatic. And the gun did have a decent amount of commercial success. Of course, some of the success is due to Winchester is obviously a very big company, especially coming out of World War II. Many people were familiar with Winchester because the guns that they went and fought across Europe or islands in the Pacific with said Winchester on them. So Winchester certainly had very good name recognition and certainly advertised very selectively to try and target those sporting-minded hunters to try and get their guns into as many hands as possible. As was typical for shotguns at the time, everybody would sort of advertise, well, our gun has much less recoil than the long recoil guns. But of course they'd be comparing the long recoil guns with their friction rings set up for the most recoil possible to whatever it was they were comparing it to. So yes, of course, an Auto 5 with its friction rings taken out is not a very comfortable gun to shoot. However, a properly configured Auto 5 is much smoother to shoot than either of these. But Winchester's goal, of course, wasn't to make the most smooth shooting shotgun. They were trying to address something, or really make something, to address concerns that people had had since long recoil guns were introduced. One of those things being long recoil guns do cycle slow, and while most of us probably don't really understand why that would be a problem, there are certain instances when hunting where being able to rip off 3 rounds as fast as possible is important, and you would be capable of outrunning a long recoil gun in some of these instances. So, say you have a flock of ducks flying over and that's the one flock of ducks you're going to see all day. By golly, you're going to want to let loose all 3 rounds so you can say you at least got to shoot your gun, and ideally you'd get all 3 of those shots, good, actually be able to place them on the ducks. It's an important thing. And so Winchester was trying to capture that, was one of their objectives is to have the gun cycle a little bit quicker. And of course their other goal was to address the adjustable friction system in the Auto 5. Now, of course, these days I think we better understand the adjustable friction system is a benefit, it's a feature, it's a good thing to have. But the issue at the time was that most people didn't understand the friction system. And of course, some of this even exists today in the era of the internet where people will say, well, my Auto 5 kicks too hard, or my Auto 5 isn't reliable, because they don't understand the friction system. So Winchester was interested in making an automatic where there's no adjustments, the gun just runs and shoots fine. There is a minor caveat to that we'll explain whenever we get to disassembling these, but the point being that once the gun is correctly set up here, you can put heavier loads, lighter loads, whatever in it, and the gun will run and cycle without you having to remember which side of the ring goes which way. And ultimately, that was really what Winchester was trying to capture here. One of their design objectives was no more having to mess around with what loads do I need the gun set up for. Now, one complaint that was lodged against the Model 50 is that it's heavy. It's about as heavy as a standard weight Auto 5, and for a 3-shot capacity gun to weigh as much as a 5-shot capacity gun, many people are going to look at that and wonder, why? Why would I spend more, because these were expensive guns at the time, why would I spend so much money on a Model 50 that only has 3-shot capacity, but it weighs as much as the 5-shot gun? Why would I choose to handicap myself in this way? Winchester would respond to this by making a version of the Model 50 that had an alloy receiver, keeping the steel barrel, keeping everything else about the design, but switching just to an alloy receiver. This gun was known as the Model 50 Lightweight, and it didn't sell extremely well. Of course, the steel gun was more popular, but the fact that the alloy gun sold at all is probably an indication that much of the market looked at the Model 50 and went, I like this, but it's too heavy. And moving to that alloy receiver did improve things a little bit. Now, one downside of that switch to an alloy receiver has to do with it's the 1950s, and aluminum alloys are not extremely well understood by most industry. As a result, you will sometimes find these 50 lightweights that have had cracked receivers. Sometimes this crack will be at the bottom of the barrel channel. In that case, I wouldn't even worry about the crack. I've seen some with that crack, and the owners don't know how long they've had the crack, and they've just kept on shooting the gun, and they've been fine. The more concerning cracks are underneath, at the bottom of the magazine tube, at the back of the charging handle slot, all the way to the rear of the receiver, or behind the trigger group. We'll point out these places later, but just a thing to be aware of is you can sometimes find the alloy receiver guns with cracks in them. Depending on where the crack is at, it can be a big enough problem that the gun's no good. And the internet is sort of hotly divided about whether or not these things can be rewelded. It seems like really talented aluminum welders say it's no problem to reweld them and fix the cracks, and that people there with sort of buzzbox MIG machines are saying, no, you probably shouldn't even bother trying. By 1958, Winchester's Model 50 and the Model 50 Lightweight had become pretty darn successful. Winchester was reporting somewhere around 20 to 25% of the automatic shotgun market belonged to them, which, considering before 1954 it was 0%, they were seriously making inroads, right? Selling tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of guns, doing a pretty good job of it. However, in 1959, Winchester would make a technological leap that I don't think most of the shotgun world has yet to keep up with. It's a truly magnificent thing known as the Winchester Model 59. They would take the alloy receiver that they had already experimented with on the Winchester Model 50. They would pair it with a special barrel. This barrel is made up of a very thin steel liner, which is wrapped in layer upon layer of fiberglass. Winchester would go and market this and advertise this 100 different ways, right? It's space age, it's composites, it's fiberglass. There's many miles of length of fiber strand involved in the manufacture of one barrel. And Winchester tooled up to weave this fiberglass into cloth and then wrap the cloth and do the layups and do the resin impregnation and then do the setting all themselves, which is a very impressive thing for a gun company to invest in for the point of making shotgun barrels. The advantage, though, is these barrels are freakishly lightweight. It's almost unbelievable, hard to describe how lightweight these barrels are. Of course, the advantage there is you have a gun that's lighter weight overall. The upside, because of the way they did these fiberglass layups, is technically these barrels are stronger pounds per inch than a steel barrel, because fiberglass is stronger per unit weight, and because the barrel profile is a little bit thicker with the lighter material than with the steel. Winchester's math involved in blowing these barrels up actually shows that the fiberglass barrels are stronger than the steel barrels they had been using. Additionally, and this was not a standard feature, it actually kind of ended up being kind of rare, Winchester would end up putting interchangeable internal thread chokes into these fiberglass barrels. Winchester would not be the first company to have factory screw-on chokes, of course. We're familiar with the poly choke and related systems. I don't really consider those true factory screw-on or screw-in choke systems because of the fact they're attached to a compensator and they weren't factory in the most uniform of sense. However, Winchester would get beat to this by just a couple of months by an Italian company known as Breda. We'll be taking a look at all of the Breda shotguns later. There's actually a ton of them, and it starts in a very interesting place, so we'll get to that part of that story later on. But Winchester was a very, very early adopter of factory interchangeable chokes, and as far as I'm aware was the first to have them screw in, because Bredas were an external thread. Winchester having this internal thread on a fiberglass barrel in 1959, I mean, I don't know that there's another way to say it than this is so far ahead of its time. I guess Benelli these days does have carbon fiber wrapped shotgun barrels, but it's not like something that they're pushing really hard. It's sort of a very min-maxed thing. Winchester put this on a commercial production firearm and sold tens of thousands of them. I think that's very, very cool. Now, there would be a few minor mechanical differences between the 50 and 59, but for the most part, pretty much every part between the guns will interchange. Might need to be some minor fitment changes between one gun and the other, but pound for pound, they're pretty much the same exact design, maybe just some small minor dimensional differences between the steel gun and the aluminum ultra-lightweight gun. Now, throughout the production span of the Model 59, Winchester would make several changes to it aimed at reducing the receiver cracks. They would end up changing alloy and then changing the heat treatment of the alloy. They'd thicken the receiver up compared to the 50 lightweight receiver. They'd end up adding features such as this sort of semicircular feature there on the back of the charging handle track to prevent the cracks that came to the back of the receiver. And what you're then really left with is a very lightweight, very competent gun that is a 3-shot automatic, which was cheaper, was slightly more expensive than the Browning Auto 5. Most places, of course, obviously costs are variable in all these, but the MSRP was slightly more than the Browning Auto 5, but ultimately less than the Browning Double Auto would have for MSRP. And if you look at them side by side, this weighs about 6¼ pounds. The Browning Double Auto 12-vet weighs about 6 3/4. The 20 weight weighs about 6 pounds, so this is sitting in weight right between them. But with it being sort of slightly cheaper, with a 1 round extra capacity, and in my opinion, an action that is smoother than the Browning Double Autos, I think this is a real winner of a shotgun, and not just for the same reasons that I think that, my opinion is the Browning Auto is technically very good, practically maybe not that great, but technically good. I think that this shotgun is actually very good, even if it's technically not that great. And what I mean by that is, of course, these receivers will still have cracks show up. And based on the best of my research, it doesn't seem like these cracks showed up very frequently on the guns back in the day. It seems like it's a sort of thing where these guns were designed, of course, in the 1950s. The loads that were available for hunting back in the 1950s, generally speaking, were not nearly as hot as the hunting loads that would develop through the 70s and 80s and 90s and on into today, where you're getting stuff that's like 4.5 or 5 dram equivalent in 2 3/4 inch 12 gauge. These guns were maybe meant for more 3.5, 4 at the absolute highest, so you're getting stuff that has a lot more recoil these days. Additionally, these guns have a recoil spring down in the stock, and I have yet to find one of these guns used where the recoil spring is at an acceptable length. It seems like springs on these guns just never got replaced, and once that spring doesn't get replaced, the bolt is not slowed down enough, and on those aluminum receivers, it starts to beat into them really darn hard. On top of this, as we'll see once we get the thing apart, technically the overall travel of the bolt system is adjustable on a plug at the end of the end tube, and so if your gun was taken apart and somebody did mess around with that plug on the back of the end tube, you could find yourself in a sort of situation where adjustments were made back here incorrectly that improperly limited the bolt travel, and now your bolt is bottoming out on the back of the plug, or worst case scenario, it bottoms out before it can get to the back of the plug and it's just bottoming out against the spring, and in that case you're going to have receivers have significantly higher loads put on them than they were designed for. That mixed with extra spicy ammunition that's come to exist since the 1950s, you kind of got a recipe for cracking aluminum receivers. However, we'll take more of a look at that as we're going ahead to get the guns taken apart. Now, again, taking the guns apart, very little difference between them. We're going to go ahead and take apart the Model 59. Reason for this being, for our shooting segment, we'll also shoot the Model 59. Not that I have much against the Model 50. I think this is a good gun, but this is just excellent. This is something else. This is a pretty decent gun. Now, when you find these guns for sale, they can be very cheap. I think I paid $150 for this Model 50. It was marked as needing work, but you could tell from the pictures it had just sort of been stored poorly, right? It's got surface rust all over it, and it looked obviously much more dirty. Took it all the way apart, cleaned it up, gun runs great. So it's one of those instances where you can find such great automatic shotguns that just need cleaned before they're completely reliable. And that is one of the things that I appreciate about not just these, but there's a lot of very underappreciated automatic shotguns out there that in their day cost like $2 grand, $2,500 in today's money, like expensive guns, very well made, that you can find for $150 because someone's too lazy to clean it. And I think that's kind of interesting. But with all that said, we'll go ahead and get our 50 set to the side here. I guess one other thing, somebody had put a scope mount on this one at some point, which is kind of funny. But there's an overall look at the 50. It's, again, just like we'll be seeing here on the 59. Go ahead and put that to the side so that we can now focus on our 59. Now, looking at the 59, external features that we have to note, Obviously, we are not cut for scope mounts here on this one. The 59 has an aluminum trigger guard. Of course, the 50 would also have a steel trigger guard. The 50 lightweights, I believe, were the first to move to the aluminum trigger guard, so those also had that. We have a walnut stock and forend. Some people will complain about the size or the feel of the grip. Personally, for me with my big hands, I think it feels fine. I've seen people complain about the grip's not long enough or the grip is too fat. Again, it could be shaped. I've seen a couple of 59s that had a straight wrist, like English stocks, and it did not appear to me that they had been, shaped to be English stocks. It looked like they might have been factory, so that might have been a very rare option that was available, as having a straight stock. But personally, I have no real issues with these stocks. It's frankly kind of hand-filling, which is uncommon to see from shotguns of this era, and of course I've got big hands, but it does fill my hand pretty well. Maybe if you had smaller or more pudgy hands, that might be a little bit of a too girthy a grip to grasp your hand around, but I think that feels quite good. The forend is maybe a little fatter. It doesn't have the sort of finger grooves that we're used to seeing on Auto 5, but I really do, again, appreciate that. Maybe it's a little bit more chunky, but I don't mind a shotgun feeling slightly more chunky, especially when it gives you more to hold on to. And especially when you're dealing with a lightweight gun like this, the more purchase your hands can get on it, the better, because that will tend to make recoil feel a little bit better. Now, as far as external features, we'd already mentioned this choke system. You can still get these chokes because it's wind choke. Wind choke stayed around for a while. Even the compensated wind chokes aren't all that hard to find. I do have a full set of chokes for this gun, which is very cool. And again, on the topic of underappreciated automatics, I'm almost embarrassed to say I paid like $270 for this with the chokes, which is kind of a screaming deal. Of course, we have a brass bead. There are very, 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 very small numbers of factory lightweight fiberglass barrels that had ribs on them. Most of the ones I'm familiar with also had factory installed poly chokes on them. Very, very rare thing to find, though. There's not very many of those that you'll actually run into. Most of the time, it's barrels without a rib, or somebody went and put like a Simmons rib and then just epoxied it on. Which, I mean, that works, as long as if you're somebody that insists on having a rib, you really like having a rib, you can put epoxy ribs on the fiberglass. It sticks just fine, especially if you sort of scuff it up first and then glue on your rib. It's certainly an option, but frankly, this thing has a nice flat diving board of a receiver, and putting the bead on top of that works just as well as any rib that you're ever really gonna be dealing with. So I have no qualms with this gun not being very frequently adorned with a rib. Some guns I feel kind of need to have a rib in order to be most usable, but this is not one where I'm like, ah, God, I really wish that had a rib. Never really had big problems there. Getting onto the controls, crossbolt safety in front of the trigger guard, which is kind of interesting. We have a bolt handle here to pull the action back. The actions on these guns are very, very smooth. I mean, you can barely even tell you're unlocking a bolt as you pull it back until you get to the end of travel. Because, as we'll see, they sort of have a push rod style ejector. I hate this ejector design in general, but because it's got that as you're pulling the bolt back, the bolt gets very stiff in the last little bit of travel as you get it to latch onto the carrier dog. Sort of a, like this is so smooth, so smooth. And then you get it to about there, as it clicks on its way back, it's like, it gets very stiff all of a sudden. That's just a minor complaint, doesn't really make a great deal of difference, but we have a bolt release here. And this shotgun is one where the bolt release has to be pushed in order to load additional shells. We'll probably talk about this, or at least show this further during the shooting segment, but the way that the carrier on this gun is designed is it is a thumb-destroying monster. This really is sort of a gun where, in order to load it, you want to take one thumb to push the carrier down and hold it down until you've got your 2 shells in the magazine, because going about it otherwise sort of involves, pushing 1 shell in, and now your thumb is stuck. Ow, and it can really hurt to get your thumb stuck in there, especially if you try and yank it out like you're going quick. So these things did earn a reputation for being thumb munchers, unless of course you adopt the sort of two-handed technique where one thumb holds the carrier all the way out of the way. Guns that would be really nice to have the sort of Browning speed load system on, be really, really nice to have that here. But at this point, these would probably be too good of guns. They would be expensive at that point, because as far as gripes that I can find about it, the loading mechanism is probably the closest thing to griping about it. And that's not really that big of a gripe, all things considered. Now, that's pretty much it for the external characteristics of the thing. Not too shabby. Going ahead and looking at disassembly, of course, we have a screw coming into the magazine tube here. This is not sort of the traditional cap that we have on the end, and as such, these can end up being pretty darn tight. Winchester included 2 convenient ways to take it apart. It is slotted like a screw on the front, However, in order to avoid boogering up the screw, I just prefer to use a punch in a punch hole that this screw also has. And the screw's got about 1 million threads on it. There we go. And that gets our fore end off. So there we can see our screw with its like 3/4 inch of threads. And you can look at this and immediately see, right? They totally had room to put an additional round in there. There's no reason that it had to be a 2-shot gun, except for the fact that, well, they wanted it to be a 2-shot gun because of the hunting laws that we explained. So this was certainly not a mechanical limitation. It's not like they couldn't figure it out. In fact, if this hanger on the barrel was further forward, you could totally just put an extended magazine tube on there and be going to town. Looking closer at the handguard, we have a little bit of aluminum reinforcement back here at the rear end of the fore end to keep it from getting crushed, but this fore end is so chunky and heavily built that I frankly don't even think that that was really needed. This is a really solid piece of wood compared to what you've got with the Auto 5. Because this thing doesn't have a reciprocating barrel, it doesn't need a channel for the barrel to be able to ride in, and as such, the actual barrel channel only has to be as wide as the mag tube, which gives you a much stiffer, sturdier handguard system. So that's certainly interesting to see. One minor note I'd like to make is that 59 handguards aren't immediately interchangeable with 50s. You can make either one's handguard work on either gun, but it does involve a bit of fitting. So in case anybody out there is really worried about their wood, if they want to change their wood out with from a 50 to a 59 or a 59 to a 50, it's possible, just involves a little bit of fitting. Now, the next step of our disassembly here is going to be to rotate the barrel over and pull it off. We have our classic Winchester interrupted thread system. I'm not going to say this is a if it ain't broke, don't fix it thing, because I'm not willing to agree that this system isn't broke, but Winchester did carry it over from the Model 12 and the 1897, and like we said before, I don't know that Winchester invented this interrupted screw takedown system, but Winchester put it on a whole lot of guns. They really were hung up on this being the best way to do stuff. But now with the barrel off, we can see this steel element is a part of the liner that comes all the way down the barrel, but the rest of it, fiberglass, 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 fiberglass the whole way down. And then our barrel eyelet is just sort of epoxied onto the fiberglass there at the very end. And I'm not sure of the answer of this. I have heard that the eyelets are either fiberglass themselves, just I guess maybe just resin with chopped glass in them and then molded, or aluminum. Frankly, looking at this one, I would be inclined to say that this barrel eyelet is aluminum, then epoxied on, but I've seen some people claim this is a fiberglass part of the barrel as well. But that's about what you got for the barrel. Notably absent from both this and the 50 is any sort of way to tension this ring. So of course you can tighten or loosen the fit of the threads between the barrel and receiver on things like the Model 12 or the 1897. You don't have that provision here. Now, is it needed here? Not really, because of the way the handguard mates up with the barrel. Most of the wiggle is taken out of the barrel. It'll just have a tiny bit of side-to-side play that really doesn't matter because this is a shotgun. If it was a rifle, it would probably matter, but on a shotgun, it's not a big deal. But it is maybe slightly annoying. I've seen some people complain, even back in the day, that they don't like the fact that the barrel isn't very stiff in the receiver. However, the Auto 5 has a similar thing. Of course, on very well-made Auto 5s, especially ones that haven't been shot a lot, the play in the barrel is actually pretty low relative to the receiver, certainly less than the 50 or 59 tend to exhibit, but you do still have a little bit of play there, so I don't think that's very legitimate criticism, the fact that the barrel has just a little bit of wobble. Now, the next step in disassembly is going to be to remove our chamber, which, if you were regularly talking about a shotgun, would sound crazy, but no, here in this case, we pull the bolt back and then we have the chamber in our hands. And these chambers will tend to be a little dirty, so we'll go ahead and grab ourselves some shop towels here, just to try and avoid tracking too much dirt all over the place. But this is our chamber. Remember, this gun has a short recoil floating chamber action. What that means is, there is sort of our barrel assembly, right? We're used to seeing this be a barrel extension that's threaded onto the barrel. But the way the shotgun works is it integrates the barrel extension into the chamber so that the bolt can lock against this. This travels back a short distance while the barrel stays still. And after this has traveled a short distance, it stops and the bolt continues backwards and unlocks itself with the momentum that it's picked up. As we already explained, if this was a rifle or a pistol, you'd be asking for accuracy trouble with this sort of a system. But in a shotgun, it's really not that big of a problem at all. And ultimately, the biggest downside to this system is that while this chamber has retracted, it can build up a lot of carbon and debris there in the barrel. So this system does need to be cleaned with some degree of frequency. I've maybe put 200 or 300 rounds through this thing, and at that point it started to have intermittent ejection trouble that didn't exist before. And I think I would attribute most of that to this barrel assembly unit, or the chamber relative to the barrel, not being able to seat fully because it was so carboned up, or it wedging itself in there so tight that it didn't want to unlock against all of that carbon that had been built up. I have not fired very many rounds since this thing was last clean, and you can see that carbon builds up there, and then you additionally have to clean its interfacing surface down there in the barrel. You can sort of do that with a rag in your pinky to stick it in there far enough, but like a cleaning towel all the way down the barrel is probably the best way to do that. Now, ordinarily, I wouldn't complain or harp so much on having to clean the gun so often, but we had just done our look at the Higgins Model 60, and I had complained about that gun having to be cleaned pretty darn frequently because gas-operated shotguns, sort of as an endemic thing, especially the Model 60, do have to be cleaned more often. And in this way, I'm going to say that the Model 59 is not perfect in that regard because it does need to be cleaned more often than practically any other recoil-operated shotgun. Compare it to the AR-17 or the double auto or the Browning Auto 5 or any of the other long recoil guns we've looked at. They don't need to be cleaned like hardly ever in comparison to a gun that carbons up its interface between its chamber and its barrel. So there's pros and cons to every system. I like this action a lot. I think it's, first off, I think it's very cool. I think it's very smart. However, there's a reason that it really was done here, and then nobody sort of bothered to do much else with this concept past this point, because it ends up having the complications of a gas-operated system because of how much carbon and debris it ends up introducing to itself, without any of the advantages of it being a gas-operated system, that being reliability and hopefully consistency of cycling velocity and these sorts of things, right? You don't get that advantage necessarily, but you do pick up the downside of it's dirty and you have to clean it more often. Now, one thing that you'll frequently see wrong with these chambers is that they'll be missing the plunger that's meant to stick out of the back of them here. Now that plunger sits on a spring and it's meant to press against a boss in the receiver that ensures that the chamber stays pushed forwards after the bolt has unlocked from it. Basically so that this is always forward in the chamber, so as to make it so that feeding is a little bit easier because your chamber is always in one fixed same spot, biased by this spring and this plunger. Now, it is very common to see these guns missing this plunger because this plunger just sort of clips into this spring, and I've just recently retightened this one because these are replacement parts, because I have shot hundreds of rounds through this gun without even noticing that the plunger was missing. It wasn't until I got my Model 50 that I went, huh, what's that? And then I went and looked, mine doesn't have that. And then realized that, oh, well, that probably needs to be there. But with our plunger reattached to our spring here, we can stuff this whole assembly back into there and then hopefully get everything repaired. This is not the most elegant thing that Winchester ever came up with here, and it's probably my number 2 complaint about these guns, is that this design isn't fantastic. I guess the only reason I don't make it a bigger complaint is it ultimately doesn't matter, right? Because the guns do work without this doodad being in there. And then we will give it a test push, make sure it can go all the way flush. And it can. It's a very stiff little spring they got in there, but now this Model 59 has a correct chamber. If you've got one of these guns and notice that plunger missing, maybe it doesn't even make a lick of difference, but that is something to watch out for there. At this point, we now have our gun down to sort of the stock and action. For most use, because this is a recoil-operated gun, this is as far apart as you'd need to take it to clean your chamber, your barrel, and if you wanted to wipe off the front part of the bolt, that's really all that you'd need to do, because very little combustion and carbon and gunk gets back into the gun because it's recoil-operated. However, if you wanted to go a step further, we have a pin that can be drifted out. Let us take the trigger group off. There's that pin. And at this point, you take the trigger group off. You can push the button on the bolt release in order to get it out of there. At this point, we have our trigger group. The trigger group on these guns is pretty darn simple, just wiping off a little excess oil that I got on there. The trigger is actually very AR-15 style, only this came well before the AR-15 had ever come along. What you have is a sear there that catches on a bottom hoof of the hammer, so just like on an AR-15. and then we have a sear notch that catches the top of the hammer, but it's a disconnector that rides on the trigger and is spring-loaded. So in this regard, wow, we've seen that before. It's like the AR-15 may have even seen this because it is very, very familiar to us. Now, this was not the first gun ever to use this sort of a fire control group mechanism, but it is surprisingly similar, and it's certainly expected that Armalite would have taken a look at this shotgun and the Browning Double Auto and all of the other lightweight shotguns they could get their hands on as they were making the AR-17. So perhaps there's maybe a little bit, just a drop of this gun's DNA that found its way into the AR-15's fire control group. And by that, I mean the fire control group that we know today, not the original one, because the original one's a little bit of a mess. But there is our trigger mechanism. Not a whole lot to explain about it there. I'm not going to detail strip the trigger group because we have these, it's a combination of a spring and a retainer for everything, and it just sucks to have to get in and out of these. It's not the worst trigger group in the world to take apart by any stretch, but it's not fun to have to detail strip one of these. If at all possible, try and avoid it. The spring for the carrier is very interesting. Again, we have one of these flat wire springs. It's all wound up funny, but our carrier dog moves this spring backwards, which is kind of funny to see. Right, it translates the spring rearwards. Bring it up here for you guys to see, but it translates that rearwards, and then it also translates it rearwards for the carrier to pick up. So you sort of have this weird seesaw sort of system. And again, another look at the fire control group up close. You have a disconnector, which has a little spring underneath it. Hammer comes back and catches there. It's just like an AR-15. The trigger spring gets its power here on the rear end. This bar pushing on it gives it the spring. And then the front half of that spring is coiled around this pin for the hammer here. And the front of this spring actually acts as the hammer spring. So it is a very, very, I guess, cool way that they had both of these springs situated. This spring retaining the hammer pin and the trigger pin, and the whole thing just sort of working. I mean, it's a very cool unison that everything works in here. And then finally, this last sort of pin-looking thing that you're seeing there is a pivot for the carrier. If you were to disassemble this, which again, I don't recommend that you do, you pull up on the carrier here and then pull it towards you, I guess up and up, in order to get the carrier off of its stud. At that point, the spring for it will go free, and you have the carrier dog rattling on the carrier. Then with the carrier out of the way, you can lift up on this spring to get the trigger pin out. Trigger pin ends up taking the disconnector out with it. And then finally, you have the hammer pin and all of this spring that you have to deal with. It's not the hardest to get back together. It's just a little bit confusing because you've got, we're not used to seeing a flat spring that goes zoop, 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 and works in that regard. Very cool trigger system, and in fact a very simple one, because in the grand scheme of things you're doing a lot of work with a spring that could have quite a bit of variation in the way that it's bent up. So that's pretty cool. Set that to the side. Now, continuing disassembly past this point is where things start to get a little bit hairy. We're going to need to take the stock off, and when I say need, you don't have to do this. It's just that you'll be fighting a spring in a funny way if you don't. So I recommend you make your next step taking the stock off. You have two Phillips heads to contend with in order to get the butt plate off. Go to our handy dandy screwdriver set here, get our big Phillips bit, and pop this off. And if you've got an original butt pad like this one, just try and be careful with it. This one has not shown signs of being brittle, but I have seen others that have, chipped and fallen apart. I think a lot of that comes down to what the gun was cleaned with, because back in the day, the style was to put whatever oil you put on your gun, you'd also put on your wood, and that wood didn't always play nice with these sort of plastic or resin butt plates. So we've got our butt plate there. The next part of getting our stock off is going to involve a look up the rear end of the stock. We have a little wishbone-shaped spring, which is going to be darn hard to show off to the camera, but this wishbone-shaped spring is going through holes in a center nut and an outer nut, and we need to compress that spring and lift it out. And doing this without causing all sorts of trouble is tricky, and I think is just best done with a pair of needle nose pliers and some patience. There we go. Getting it out is one thing. Getting it back in is a whole other thing. So there's the spring out of the gun. If you've got one of these guns, you can still buy these. It might not be a bad idea to just get a couple, because it is possible to just completely bend the crap out of the springs trying to put it down into that slot like this. Not the best design decision. Additionally, we're now going to have to remove that center nut in there. That center nut compresses the recoil spring and is sort of responsible for setting the overall travel of the bolt system. If that center nut is adjusted wrong, and we'll go over how to adjust it correctly, but if it is adjusted wrong, you can see that battering and damaging of receivers happen more often. Now, that center plug is aluminum, which is okay because, at least on these guns, it's into an aluminum tube. However, you'll sometimes find these plugs so that they're really corroded in there, and if that's the case, it's probably one of those sort of PB blaster and pray situations, but we'll go ahead and back this off bit by bit. It will eventually try and launch itself out of there, so we'll just have to be careful and try and catch our tool. There it goes. And here we have our plug, a little piece of aluminum. Sorry if that was all out of focus, but if you've got your gun in front of you, it will be very obvious what to do. We then have our spring. This is a replacement spring. As I recall, the rule of thumb is to take a tape measure, and if the spring is under 12 inches, it ought to be replaced. This one is at 12 1/4, which is what the new ones are. I've seen springs that are like compressed down to 11 inches and still in use in guns. And certainly at that point, the effective force of the spring is going to be substantially less. So good idea to replace these springs. Numrich has extra springs. Wolf sells extra springs. Really good idea if you get one of these, maybe even preemptively. Just get a spring and plan on replacing it. I normally don't like when people just preemptively replace springs before they're bad, but I have never seen one of these guns with a good spring. As a result, I think it's one of the situations where you can sort of just plan on replacing the spring because it seems like nobody else ever did with these things. With the spring removed, we can then get the stock off if you want to. There's no requirement to take the stock off at this point, but there's like, 4 little castellations on a very funny screw nut type thing, only you're going to need a pretty darn specialized screwdriver. And what I mean by that is you're probably going to have to be grinding your own screwdriver out of a piece of like flat steel. Maybe you've got a piece of flat steel that would fit in the slots and then just welded a handle onto it to turn it. It's a little bit of a funky screw to have to get in and out of there. And as luck would have it, I do not know where the tool that I made for getting these out has gone off to. It's probably out somewhere on the mill and may have ended up being used as a parallel for a different job, at which point it's probably now bent, and I'd have to make a new one anyway. But that is a tool that you'd need if you've got a loose stock. This is the thing that you tighten to tighten up the stock. If you need to get the stock off, you're going to need that sort of funny spanner tool. Yeah, so I had to go and check just because I had the idea, right? Because the tool I had first used, I ended up using as a parallel. Well, I'm not actually going to wrench on this because this is one of my good Starrett parallels, but it is a 3/16 inch high by an 1 1/8 wide, which is slightly wide. I mean, it's just going to sort of touch the wood as you stick it down in there, but that goes in with just a little bit of wobble, so you maybe want to be slightly wider than your sort of 3/16 of an inch. Maybe if you're at a 1/4 inch, it would be perfect, but with this tool, you'd totally be able to tighten that if you needed to. So this is about what your tool would look like. If you machined yourself something that would stick down in there like that, you could put pliers on it here, crank on it, you get your stocks in and out no problem. But at this point, we're ready to get the bolt out of the gun. We can take our calipers. You do not need your calipers for disassembling this gun. That was just to check our parallel here, which we'll set to the side as well. So, getting the bolt out of this gun. Again, I have done this without taking the recoil spring out. It is entirely possible to do. You're just going to be wrestling the rest of the gun the entire time. It's much easier to do with no spring pressure on anything. So what you'll want to do is pull the bolt back so that this pin aligns with this disassembly hole, and then take a punch and push the disassembly pin out. Doing that when it's under spring pressure is not great, especially because the sort of center support on this bolt will then rock it forward because it's no longer slaved to the bolt. But with no spring pressure, we can take the charging handle forward, take it off, push the rest of the bolt forward, and it'll be a little bit of finagling to get it, but eventually you can get it to line up with the center support and come back. The center support will come back, and then the bolt can lift out like so. So there we have our disassembled Model 59 action. Again, doing that with the spring in the gun is possible, but it's really hard. And then additionally, when the spring's in the gun, getting the reaction rod is I think what the technical name of this part is called. It's really just a great big steel mass with a great big beefy bolt carrier tail on it that holds everything together here. Point being, of course, because this is a short recoil operated gun, you need to balance out the mass of the reciprocating parts, because the mass and velocity of the shot going that way is going to be mirrored in the parts going backwards. And because you don't have a whole barrel you're hauling around, you just have this small chamber piece plus the bolt, you need a great big extra bit of mass that goes down into the stock. So that's sort of the secret to this gun's action, if you will. But there is our reaction rod. The other interesting part, I don't think reaction rod's the right name for it. It's something rod. It's the technical part. I'm just going to call it the mass, the floating mass. What this floating mass is actually additionally responsible for is, right, here's your lockup. You can see that now. Your bolt will come in here, and the rear end of it will tilt in to lock into the carrier, or the chamber, like so. This gun really tries to defy the bolt carrier trunnion relationship, right? Because you've got a bolt thing, you don't really have a carrier, and then you have a chamber instead of a trunnion. It's very cool. But there is how those two lock into each other. Of course, once the gun fires, this all will be shunted backwards. Now, if we reassemble everything fully here, it'll be a little awkward to hold because of just how heavy everything is, but we stick this pin back through all of the pieces, right? Remember, we have this hole here, and that's important. Once we have the pin through everything, we'll be able to see that, right, this assembly gets sprung forward and we don't actually need the charging handle, so it can go out of the way. So this assembly is pushed forward by the spring. The spring will push everything up into lock like so. This will sort of be the shape everything's in. When the gun fires, everything is going to jut backwards, and then this chamber piece is going to hit that stop, that sort of shelf there in the receiver. It's going to hit that and stop. So this has all been moving backwards very fast for just a brief moment, but now the chamber is stopped. This will also stop the bolt because they're locked together, but what it won't stop is this great big mass back here. It's going to keep going and keep going and keep going and hit this ramped surface right here. This ramped surface is specifically what Williams was so interested in making perfect on these guns, because for the unlocking to be timed right and not to bind the gun up, this has to be a very specific gradual ramp. This is especially made difficult because the variations that you'll have in shotgun shell pressure and loading mean that with light recoil rounds, you're not going to have as much energy here, but they're also not going to be stuck as tight in the chamber. Conversely, with heavier loads, they're going to be more stuck in there, and there's going to be a lot more velocity here. So it's dwelling out that velocity, slowing it down to the point that everything can unlock in a reasonably consistent way. But as these parts move rearward and come to this point, the sort of inertia, right, the movement of this rod, not to say that this is an inertia-operated shotgun. I always hate saying the term inertia. I should say momentum. The momentum of this rod, which has already been moving backwards to get to this point, will tug the bolt down, and because the chamber is stopped against that boss in the receiver, it will tug the bolt down and then pull the bolt free as it continues cycling. And of course, this spring lives back here. So in this way, you can then see sort of all of the pieces of this short recoil system. It's in fact very similar to the AR-17 in a lot of regards, only the AR-17 has that, in fact, very AR-15-esque bolt and carrier relationship where it's a rotating bolt system. This has a tilting bolt system, and the way that bolt gets untilted is by your mass being back here on this rod. If you're to analogize it, this is the bolt carrier, only it makes my skin crawl to call this a bolt carrier, but this plays the job of a bolt carrier. Like if this was an AR-17, this is doing the job of the bolt carrier, this is doing the job of the bolt. So it's a very interesting system to look at in that regard. Additionally, you have a little bit of an out-of-battery system afforded by the fact that this bolt carrier tail has a partial slot in it milled for the hammer, but the hammer can't see the firing pin until it's really all the way forward. And by the time it's all the way forward, it will have locked up into the chamber here, like so. But that's pretty much it for the action of the shotgun. As far as further disassembly, right, magazine tubes will come out. They are cross-pinned here in the front. Removing that cross pin will make it so that you can take the plug in the end of the magazine tube out, and then you can get the guts out of the magazine tube. The magazine tubes are just threaded into receivers, so you can get them out that way. Additionally, we have a little pin here for the bolt release. The bolt release is, I guess, as you'd expect, right? It's a combination of shell stop whenever the bolt is forward, and then once the bolts come back, it sort of converts into a bolt carrier lock until the shell has pushed the rear end of it out of the way, at which point it tells the gun that it's ready to feed another round after the carrier dog has been depressed. So we're familiar with sort of how these systems work already. It's not dissimilar to the Auto 5, it's just that you're taking out the timing element of the barrel has to come forward first. Because we don't have to wait for the barrel to come forward first, because the barrel doesn't move, we sort of speed up the cycling, which is why these things, as we explained earlier, cycle quicker. The one last piece we didn't talk about, and it's just because it's there on the inside of the gun, is you have a left hand and a right hand sort of piece here, I guess flanking pieces that flank the bolt. Really all these are there for is making it so that the bolt can interface with receiver rails. You have a rail here and a rail there, and then two studs here that lock into corresponding features on the bolt, and then have a hole to catch that pin as well. But if we lock these in here, you can sort of see that these are not a part of the bolt, right? These don't turn the bolt into acting like a bolt carrier in any meaningful way. These are just there to interface the bolt against the receiver to keep the bolt from pivoting too much as it's coming back and forth. So they're more like anti-binding or shims, or probably more practically, they're kept off the bolt so that A, the bolt is able to tilt, because the bolt has to be able to tilt to lock independent of these. First reason these are separate. Second reason these are separate, this bolt is actually pretty darn simple to machine because it doesn't have any notches or rails or interface with the receiver directly. So it's kind of a cool design in that regard. But there's our bolt. Further disassembly of the bolt, right? You've got a pin for a singular extractor. You have a ejector, which is spring-loaded. You can sort of push it forward and then off to the side and then back out, but it feels like you're breaking it whenever you're doing it, but that's how you can get the ejector off. And of course it's a plunger-style ejector. We've talked about the fact that I don't think those are very good, but that's what you're dealing with here. And finally you have your firing pin right there, and your firing pin retaining pin is hidden behind the ejector here. So you pull your ejector off to the side, get it out, drive the pin this way, I believe, and then you have your firing pin to come out the back. But finally, with that all discussed, we've got this gun all the way apart and we're ready to put it all the way back together. And while we ordinarily fast forward through this process, we'd already talked about the reassembly of this buffer, this plug on the end of the spring tube, is important. Because of that, and because putting this thing back together is a little bit of a Tetris game, we'll go through at least the first half of assembly step by step, because I don't want somebody seeing the fast forward and they just put this plug in wherever they think it goes, and then they end up with a gun that's liable to break itself, liable to cause trouble or crack receivers or whatever. So we will go through these steps step by step. The first one will be to reinstall this rod. This is the top. The top only has a very small groove, a short groove. This is the bottom. The bottom has a groove along its whole length. It goes in like this. Of course, the bottom is towards me at this point, bottom relative to the gun. This gets shoved up the back end of the gun and will stick out into the receiver like so. We don't need it to stick out all the way just yet though, because first we have to set our bolt down in there. Now you can set the bolt in and then put the side plates on, or you can try and put the side plates in there first and then set the bolt down. I prefer to put the side plates in first and then go for putting the bolt in. And I guess as far as orientation of the side plates, because it is slightly ambiguous. Of course, the charging handle goes on the right side. The other plate that doesn't have a charging handle goes on the left side. And the rails on both of them, you have a rail here and a rail there, the rails go to the bottom. So this plate will go in like so, just like that. This plate for the charging handle, really I guess it can go in this way, it can go in either way. But now we need to hold those plates, and the way that I do that is don't turn the receiver straight up so that this plate will, this way, this plate can stay in there sort of under friction or just gravity's holding it in place. And then we take our bolt, nose in first, stick it down in there, and then push the bolt so that it retains both of these plates. Really, really hard for me to show it off to a camera, but the idea is you have a plate on either side and the bolt will sort of push forward to those plates to keep the plates retained against the side of the receiver. Once you've done that, you can get the holes lined up, because you're going to have a hole in this plate, a hole in the bolt, a hole in the other plate, and your job at this point is to get all of those sort of lined up in a row. Flip that over. This plate is always hardest because you can only barely see it. So the best way to do it is to look from above to see if you can spot the hole through everything. As easy as this gun comes apart, it does not go back together quite as easily. There we've about, and again, a punch to use as a slave pin is extremely valuable for this task. There we've got that lined up. Again, it's so hard to show this to a camera because the gun is sort of meant to be assembled on its side, but I'm just sticking a punch through all of the pieces to feel that they are in fact lined up. And now we'll take that carrier rod. Now if you remember on this sort of carrier rod mass system, it has a hole through it. That hole is going to line up with all of the other holes, right? So there's the big secret, is now we have to come through with this piece, and now we have a hole in the receiver, to a hole in the charging handle, to a hole in the bolt, to a hole on the opposite side of the bolt. Sorry, no, that's not even right. You have a hole in the receiver, to a hole in the charging handle, to a hole in one side of the bolt, to a hole in the rod, to a hole in the other side of the bolt, to a hole in the plate, which is a lot of holes to have to try and line up. And this is the perhaps the trickiest, second trickiest part of putting these guns back together, is having to get all of these to finally line up. I will just have to try and eyeball this as best I can. And it really is something that you kind of have to do sideways. There we go. That was pretty easy, actually. This is not the right pin. This is the right pin. And that should just wiggle down through everything. And you'll know you have it good when the pin goes all the way through. And you can push the bolt forward and backward and forward. And it's got both plates coming with it. At that point, you know everything is all good there, which is a relief. Just to show you guys the relative spacing of these parts, that's sort of what it looks like. That's sort of what it looks like when everything's lined up, the relative position of your carrier tail there, to the bolt, to the plate on either side. That's what you're looking to get. At this point, you can push that whole assembly forward, because now we're on to installing the recoil assembly, right? First off, the spring just goes right up the rear end of the stock. It'll find itself guided onto the end of that rod. And then at this point, you have the not so fun job of pushing this plug down against that recoil spring force, because that spring is actually pretty heavy. I don't have a lot of advice on how to do this without risking losing, rocketing this off into space. I'm just going to hold it against my lap here and take this rod that I've got as a screwdriver and just try to stuff it down and make a threading in motion and hope that it finds the threads. Yeah, we might have got it there on our first try. That's not too bad. Now, when threading it in, as we've explained, the further you thread it in, you sort of end up limiting the overall bolt travel. Now there is a spec in the gun's sort of shop manual that tells you how far the bolt should be able to travel. And basically what that is you get it all the way to the point that it's sort of caught in the carrier dog, that it feels like it's all the way back, and then feel how much free travel overall it has. Of course, we'll have to put the trigger group back in to establish that. But for now, sort of the starting place that I recommend is you thread the plug into the stock until the plug is just sitting a little bit below flush relative to the stock retaining nut. So we'll start with it sort of in there. From the camera's perspective, I'm not sure that that's going to mean a whole lot, but the face of that plug is just currently slightly below, maybe one full rotation below being flush with the outside nut. And at this point, we can reinstall the trigger group so that we can do this check on the free travel of the recoil system, like so. Let's stick that pin back in, and place. So what we'll do is pull the bolt all the way to the back, let it catch on the carrier dog. You should have between 1/16 and 1/8 inch of movement backwards past this point. There's a little bit there. I mean, you can use calipers. In fact, sort of part of the reason I have plastic calipers is for measuring things on guns without scratching them up. If we switch this over to inch and do 0.12, that's sort of the maximum that it should have. I need to measure this from over here so I can eyeball it. Get it lined up with a fixed point on the charging handle. I'd say that's slightly more than 1/16 of an inch in overall travel, so this positioning is good. Now, if you threaded that plug in further, you can get it to the point that the charging handle can't even get far enough back to lock on the dog. That's really bad, and it's a way to end up breaking things, so you don't want that to happen. If you have it threaded out too far, you can make it so that the charging handle bottoms out against the receiver. That's extremely bad, and that's how you end up cracking receivers. So those are the things to watch out for. That's how to adjust it. I guess the shop manual for this gun, if I can find a version of the shop manual in PDF form, I'll see if I can't link to it if somebody else has it available online somewhere. But it's a useful thing if you own these guns to read through it, because it does walk you through the adjustment of that system. And it seems to me that the adjustment of that system is where things go wrong most frequently, because usually what you'll find is people take the recoil system out to make getting the bolt in and out of the gun a little bit easier. And whenever they're in there messing around, fooling around with the recoil system, they thread the plug in as far as it'll go until it bottoms out, and then just back it off a little bit to get the pin into it. Assuming you have the pin in it, because I've seen a couple of these guns that just don't have pins, which lets you know somebody's been in there and they've done things wrong. And then things are adjusted such that you really have to jackhammer the bolt backwards to get it to latch onto the dog and cycle it all. And that's going to be beating up the gun because your recoil rod is compressing the spring too much and bottoming out on that plug, and that's not what you want to have happen. So that's sort of the spiel there as far as the adjustment of that system. Now, the last thing to deal with here is getting this spring back in. And boy, let me tell you, it is it's either something that just goes straight away on your first time, no trouble, or you sit there and fight the gun for like a half hour. I've had it go both ways before. But if you've got one of the guns in front of you, you'll be able to see what I'm doing with the spring very easily. There's holes that are drilled into the outer nut that holds the stock on, and you just have to put the pin, this little U-shaped clip spring thing, between those holes. Oh, what a fun task. There it is. I'm sure that was completely worthless to you guys with the camera, but recommended tools are a screwdriver and a pair of needle nose pliers, and most importantly, a bit of patience, but eventually you'll get that pin in there, retaining your end cap at the correct spot. But with the recoil assembly put back together, the last thing to check is, once you've got it retained, double check that charging handle cannot travel more than that 1/8 inch. And what I recommend that you do is, of course, pull hard, because there's a little bit of give that you just sort of have, but then there's a final amount of sort of travel that you got there. So with this one, it's under 1/8 of an inch, a little bit more than 1/16 of an inch is what you want to see. All that's done correctly. At this point, we'll just throw the last pieces of the gun back on there, sort of the reverse of assembly, and then we'll go ahead, take the thing out, and do a little bit of shooting with it. And with that, we got the gun back together. Let's go ahead, take it outside, do a little bit of shooting with it, then come back here for our final thoughts and conclusions on the Winchester 50 and 59. We're out here with our Winchester Model 59. Now, we left the Model 50 back at the house. Of course, as we've already explained, the 59 is the much more interesting of the two guns, not just mechanically, but because it was so far ahead of its time in comparison. And frankly, shooting the Model 50 feels like shooting a Model 59 that's just slightly heavier. It has the same feeling to the recoil. It just doesn't move the gun as much, so it doesn't move you as much. If you're recoil averse, the 50 is certainly a nicer shooting experience, let's say. But if you're not recoil averse, and especially if you like lightweight automatics, this thing is really, really hard to beat, even comparing it to things like the AR-17 or the Browning Double Auto. It's a really, really slick gun. Now, our standard disclaimer, we're shooting clay targets here in order to sort of show the thing off. These clay targets are rather close to us. They're very easy target presentations so that you guys can see the bird in flight a little easier. If I put it out there further, making it a sort of more difficult shot, you guys wouldn't be able to see it as easy. And the viewing experience is what I'm trying to cater to here. It also gives me the benefit of not looking as silly because I won't miss as much because they're easier targets. Now, moving on, in order to load the Winchester 59, we'll simply pull the bolt to the rearward position. Once it's in the rear, we can drop a shell in the chamber, hit the bolt release to send the bolt forward. The bolt release does need to be held in to load additional shells for our maximum capacity of 1 in the chamber, plus only 2 in the tube. Now, some people may look at this and go, well, isn't that a bad thing? Yes and no. A lot of states, and then federally, by the time this gun existed, there was a 3-round limit for hunting, federally for waterfowl, but a lot of states sort of implemented that for all sort of hunting of birds that you'd do. So having a 3-shot automatic perhaps makes even more sense than a 2-shot automatic, because at most you're really going to be using 3 shots as a sportsman. Now, these days, and even back then, people looked on that as I'm spending a lot of money for less capacity. But how often do you use the full capacity of an Auto 5 besides showing it off on videos or doing silly mag dumps? Almost never, unless you're hunting in a region that allows you to use that added capacity, at which point it can make a pretty substantial difference. However, for states that are so limited to 3 rounds, especially when you could use lead ammo for waterfowl, there's nothing wrong with this being a 3-shot automatic. Now, with the gun loaded up, we can go ahead and try it out on a couple of targets. We'll start with the gun mounted. And this is just one of those guns that it does fit me very well, right? So like normally it's an excuse where a lot of the guns I have don't fit me very well as I'm showing them off. This thing does fit me very well, and it makes it very easy for me to shoot. Additionally, this is a really lightweight gun. It's maybe slightly heavier than the Browning Double Auto 20 weight we looked at previously, but it's not that much heavier. So there's not that much more mass soaking up the recoil here, but this doesn't give me that rubberneck effect. It's not uncomfortable at all to shoot. It really is a smooth action, and I would say that this gun's action is better than the Browning Double Auto's action, just because in its lightweight configuration, this doesn't have the gun jerking back and forth whiplash effect that I feel in my neck the way I do with the 20 weight. Now, the gun is a little bit heavier as a trade-off for that, but it's not, I don't think, heavier enough to make a difference. So the 20 weight, you're getting that super cool fast loading system. Here you're getting a gun that doesn't hurt your neck to shoot. I kind of prefer this, all things considered. Now, the other thing I should mention is I am shooting light loads through this gun today. You can put heavy loads through it. I've done it. Even those sort of like heavy 1,400 foot per second, 1.25 ounce pheasant loads, you can put those through it. The gun will cycle it. The gun will obviously recoil. You'll feel quite a bit more recoil in your shoulder. However, especially with the Model 59s like we talked about, the receivers are prone to cracking with too heavy, too steady a diet of too heavy a load. Right, it can crack there, it can crack here, and it can crack at the rear of the charging handle, which is why they ended up implementing different heat treating processes through the later end of the production of the 59 to try and combat these things. Because even back then, people desired to put the heaviest loads possible through the lightest guns, which somewhat bewildering to me. The unfortunate thing, though, is that finding lightweight pheasant loads these days is kind of tricky, and by lightweight, I mean it's not 1,400 foot per second, 1.25 ounces. Finding something lighter than that can be a little bit difficult. So if you were to want to take one of these pheasant hunting with lead ammo these days, your options are a little limited in that regard, where you might have to end up hand loading. At some point, I certainly do want to take this thing pheasant hunting because it is such a handy, it's just such a great little gun. Fiberglass barrel is awesome, and I can't stress enough how awesome interchangeable chokes in the 1950s is. It's almost hard to describe. Like, the glass-wrapped barrel, obviously ahead of its time. It's so far ahead of its time, nobody has even caught up to realize how cool it is yet. But on top of that, interchangeable chokes threaded in the front, internally threaded chokes, because obviously Breda had beat Winchester to interchangeable chokes by just a couple of years. But being internally threaded like this, Winchester was really onto something there. And it showed up in a gun as innovative, as weird as this. I hate to sound like I'm gushing too much about this gun, but it really is one of those like special hidden gems, and not many people are even aware that these exist, let alone how good they are. But with all that glazing aside, we'll see if we can't temper that some by trying a little bit of shooting from the hip. We'll go ahead, start with the gun down in our hip, pull the bird, then try and see if we can't snap the gun right onto the target, then hit the bird, you pick up the bird and then hit it sort of in one motion. This is a really, really easy gun for me to shoot. It's just so stinking intuitive. I like this gun a lot. I don't know if I've said that. One thing I will say to this gun's detriment is that loading it, it wants to get your thumb every darn time you go to put a shell into it. It's managing to pitch my thumbnail. So if you are somebody that's got big thumbs, it's got a very thumb-hungry sort of loading gate. We've looked at other shotguns that have that, but it is particularly not great here. A spot of bad news, we lost our battery on the main camera, so you guys will have to put up with the worse audio off of the GoPro here. What I would like to try, because we can't do slow-mo with the camera now, is 3 rapid-fire shots, and maybe that's just the easy way to load this thing, is you have to use your thumb to hold back the rear of the loading gate when you put shells in. It seems to work a whole lot better to avoid getting your finger caught, but what I'd like to try here is, in lieu of doing slow-mo rapid fire, which we can get another day or something, I'm going to throw 1 bird and then shoot 3 times at it, even though with this choke and this setup in this range, we're just powdering them. We'll see if we can't just tear 3 rounds through the thing for fun. All 3 of those shells were in the air before the first hit the ground, which is pretty darn impressive. This thing's got a fast cycling action. It does a decent job of absorbing the recoil. Now, I can't say that this is as smooth as like a good long recoil gun, because it's just not. But despite that, it is smoother than a lot of gas-operated guns. Maybe not all of them. So certainly Beretta's modern stuff, right, is going to beat this on smoothness. But nothing's going to really beat this thing on weight. Additionally, this thing doesn't really have the big problem of gas-operated shotguns where it gets itself so dirty it won't end up running and it ends up being sluggish. That said, you will run into issues with these where they get dirty enough that they end up having the chamber not want to come all the way home, and it does get sticky to be able to manually rack it. It is sort of more prone to dirt fouling than maybe your traditional long recoil design or other short recoil designs, but all things considered, it's not that big of a problem. So with our camera battery dead and the Winchester 59 being too darn easy to shoot, I think we're going to go ahead and call it there, head back inside now that you guys have the idea, right? This really is one of those guns where once you've seen it once, you've seen it 100 times. Man, I like these stupid things a lot. It's light, it's pointy, it's not terribly well balanced. It does have a lot more weight in the back than maybe in the front, and usually I like a gun that's lightweight in the front, but this thing's like shockingly light in the front. But all things considered, these things are really, really cool. Well, that's been our look at the Winchester Model 50 and 59. I guess more so at the 59 than the 50, but a lot of that just comes down to, I think the 59 is really, really quite good. I think the 50 is just okay. Because of how heavy the 50 is and compared to sort of where it sat in time and history, I don't know that there's ever really a time where getting a Model 50 instead of an Auto 5 makes a lot of sense. Meanwhile, here with the 59, because of its weight savings, I think there are instances where it beats out an Auto 5. Now, if you're to do the most apples-to-apples comparison, like a super lightweight Auto 5 to this, I think the super lightweight Auto 5 is going to win out every time. But super lightweight Auto 5s were really not at all available in the United States, and so when you find them these days, they're pretty darn expensive guns. I think they are worth that expense. I think they're fantastic guns, but these cost a quarter as much. When you can find these at a quarter as much, I really do think that they have something special to offer, where these days, because they are so poorly known, they really do offer a very interesting combination of they are reliable guns with things that we've noted about the aluminum receivers. Besides that fact, right, they're durable guns. Parts are still generally available for them because there were, tons of these made. That, that even though it didn't live a very long time, a lot of them were sold. Winchester ended up capturing almost 30% of the automatic shotgun market by the time that they moved on from this design in a bid to try and cut costs and corners as they went. And ultimately, we'll look in a future video at sort of where they went from here. It was a gas-operated gun, and it was not a good gun. But they sort of, like, across the board, right, Winchester sort of abandoned there in the 1964 time frame. They stopped trying to make every gun good and very high quality and started trying to make consumer-end guns. Not dissimilar to the sort of quality that Ruger has always exemplified, where they're not bad, but they're not good, right? It's not like they put every effort into making them as good as they could be. Instead, they're like, well, we can cut corners here, here, and here, and most people won't notice. So Winchester went that direction. They ended up ditching this gun for a gas-operated gun, and ultimately this gun's legacy seems to be more or less obscurity, where the people who own them, I think by and large appreciate how good they are, but people who see them on shelves walk right past them, assuming it's just another uninteresting old shotgun. And I think that's a serious disservice to them. Now, with all of that said, I will temper that by saying I don't think that these are perfect guns by any stretch. Certainly the assembly and disassembly is just a little bit of a mess. Maybe in the grand scheme of things, you don't have to disassemble it to get the bolt out very frequently. Much like with the Auto 5, right? Doing that with an Auto 5 is a little bit of a chore, but I think it might be slightly easier with the Auto 5 and all of its screws than the lining up and the adjustment of this little cap there in the end. It's just a little bit too finicky to do with these, especially for common people, and especially because the springs don't get replaced, and it can lead to those fragility issues with the aluminum receivers that we had pointed out. So that's not great, and that's a serious knock against this gun. But besides that knock, and besides the fact that recoil feel, as we sort of talked about when we were shooting, it's nowhere near as smooth as a long recoil gun. But this thing is smooth like a gas-operated gun is, where it's fast cycling, but it's not abrupt. It's definitely smoother than the inertia guns that we've already looked at and that we'll end up looking at, because it does sort of buffer that recoil impulse against the spring. In the grand scheme of things, I would say that this is more abrupt, but less new. It's more abrupt but more comfortable than the Browning double auto, especially the lightweight Browning double autos, which is a serious plus because the complexity in this gun's recoil system is a spring, versus the double auto's got like multiple friction pieces and chamfer rings and a great big spring and a barrel that can travel a variable amount. Browning way over-engineered that, and the end result was a smooth recoil impulse, but in a lightweight gun that cycles as fast as the double auto does. Smooth doesn't necessarily equate to comfortable. And of course, in the double auto video I talked about those lightweight double autos specifically, I feel in my neck, like I feel a recoil impulse in my neck. And I have since making that video talked to other people that agree, like, yeah, that's the problem with the gun, is like the recoil impulse shifts, the gun's movement is very smooth, but the movement that induces in your body gives you some sort of a whiplash effect. Don't get that at all with this. And in the grand scheme of things, I think that this is a good gun to compare, again, to the double auto, but also to the AR-17, where this is way cheaper than the AR-17. It's way more durable than the AR-17. You have an extra round of capacity compared to the AR-17. You don't have the goofy loading system compared to the AR-17. And though you do weigh about a pound more than the AR-17, and a pound is a lot when we're talking about shotguns in this weight range, right? The AR-17 being a 5-6 pound shotgun, and this being a 6-7 pound shotgun. Oh my god. And this being a shotgun that sort of sits there at the 6 plus 6 1/4, 6.5 pound range, it is comparable to the AR-17 in many ways. And frankly, I think the recoil impulse is smoother. I think that it is more reliable, more durable. And in the grand scheme of things, this is probably a better super lightweight shotgun than the AR-17 is. And hopefully, as I'm going through and explaining all these things about, oh, it's lightweight, it's great, it's fancy, it points well, hopefully that helps it make more sense why I'm talking about the 59 specifically and not the 50. Because the 50 weighs like 8.5 pounds. It's a heavy, not actually 8.5, it weighs about 8 pounds even. But it's a heavy gun. And with all of that extra weight in the gun, especially because, you know, on the Model 50, right, it is also very rear end heavy. Even though it's got a steel barrel, a lot of that weight is still concentrated in the back of the gun. And so while it still maintains the similar balance to this gun, where it's very light out front and it makes it pretty easy to sweep with, but because the weight's still present in the back, it's not impossible to smooth. It's not impossible to have a smooth swing with it, but it's also very easy to accelerate the gun. It's true of the Model 50 as well in terms of the balance, but the overall weight of the gun does make it, you know, less apt for carrying around as you're hunting. It really just makes it, in my opinion, a less apt gun for pretty much everything, except that the added weight does make the recoil impulse much smoother. So if you're recoil averse, the Model 50 is a much better choice than the Model 59. But if the recoil really doesn't bother you that much, and or you like a light shotgun, I'm telling you guys, there's something special going on in this gun in that limited regard anyway. It's a very, very good lightweight automatic shotgun. And I like lightweight automatic shotguns. I think at this point I pretty much have all of them. I will have videos on all of them eventually anyway. But this is a really good one. It's a frankly impressive, way underrated example of them. And that's not to tarnish the Model 50 too much, because it still has that reliable, it still has that durable, it still has most of the good things, but it doesn't have the lightweight, and I think the lightweight is part of what makes me like this gun so much. In fact, if the 59 didn't exist and it was just the 50 and not the 50 lightweight either, it was just the 50 that ever existed, I would probably have a more negative opinion about the 50 in general, because I can't really separate how I feel about the 50 away from how I feel about this, because the 50 sort of was responsible for spawning this. If it was just the 50, I'd probably feel a little bit more negative about it in general, because it is ultimately, right, what is it at the end of the day when you're just looking at a 50? It was a gun that was more expensive than the Auto 5, that's about as heavy as the Auto 5, that cycles quicker, albeit nowhere near as smooth as the Auto 5, and the only plausible upside for all of this is that you don't have to flip a friction ring around, which shouldn't be understood as an advantage. It should be understood as, you know, people who don't know how their gun works don't have to worry about it so much, which for me, and I think for most shotgun shooters these days, it's sort of expected you to understand how your gun works because it's at your fingertips on your phone. You can learn how your gun works very easily these days compared to back then. So I don't think it's necessarily a disadvantage, right? The concept, the philosophy in military firearm design is one of trying to have high levels of affordance where you don't have to know how the gun works to know how the gun works. You can just pick it up and everything does what it sort of looks like and what it seems. Well, the Browning friction system has never been that way. It's always been something that you have to understand how the gun works to understand how the gun works. And so as a result, it's something that in the hands of people who don't bother to take the time or can't bother to take the time or don't care, they're going to have, you know, differing experiences or a negative experience because they just don't know how the gun works. So in military firearms, that's all very, very important. In civilian sporting firearms, I don't think that's as important, and I think that when you have designs like the Model 50 where you're getting rid of that adjustability and the upside is stupid people can use the gun, I don't think that's a good trade-off at all. People are welcome to disagree with me on that point. You know, maybe there is something to be said for you can just hand the gun to anybody and it increases its resale value if you can sell it to any idiot and the idiot's not going to have a bad time or a bad experience with it. Maybe that's all true, but I sort of like having the advantage of control. So the same way that the AK makes for an excellent military firearm, I think the Browning friction system makes for an excellent sporting firearm, because in sport you have that ability to take the time to adjust it if you need to switch ammunition in a way that, you know, an AK with an adjustable gas block would not be a good military firearm, because invariably you're going to have people start fiddling with it and causing trouble for themselves. So that's sort of my thoughts sort of wrapped up there on the Model 50. The 59, though, I can start to overlook some of those things because your trade-off is now in favor of having that lightweight, and the lightweight this gun pulls off is fantastic. Again, I'll reiterate just one more time, I do still think the super lightweight Auto 5s, you know, the alloy receiver Auto 5s, which are very rare in the United States, they're very expensive in the United States, but I think it's a hands-down better gun than this, because you're picking up maybe a half pound of weight for the 2 extra rounds of capacity, for the silky smooth recoil, and for the broader Auto 5 parts familiarity, and then this Browning speed load system. And at the end of the day, much better shotgun, but they're also much more expensive. They're also much rarer than you can find these for. So as a result, sum total, I think these are really cool guns. I think they're worth checking out. In the grand scheme of trying to use them these days, right? I know I haven't done this for all of the videos because I guess I haven't been a waterfowl hunter since I've picked up waterfowl hunting since started making these videos. So I'd like to start addressing the use of steel shot with some of these things, because of course that's the major concern these days compared to when these guns were designed. You didn't have to use steel shot to shoot ducks then, you do now. So if you are so concerned, the use of these with the wind chokes, like the 59 specifically, I don't know that it would make as great a duck gun, what with the use of steel shot, because everything is such high velocity. I don't think, with modern wads, I doubt that the barrel liner would be in much trouble, and I don't think that the choke would be in too much trouble either. I think that you could get away with 2 3/4 steel shot, for whatever that's worth through this thing, without being too much of a handicap, as long as you had a modified or less choke in it. Meanwhile, in the case of the Model 50, especially with as cheap as you can get those, I think they'd actually be a fantastic duck gun in the modern era. Because the extra weight and the extra durability in the receiver is going to be fine with the modern 2 3/4 duck pounder loads that you're going to be putting through it. I don't think that you'd have a problem there. As long as your choke was modified or less, I think that you'd be fine slamming anything up to like at least a B-size shot. Maybe with double Bs you'd start to have to worry if it was a mod choke and you'd want improved cylinder, but I think that the 50 would be a totally fine duck hunting gun. And in fact, probably next year's duck season, I would like to take mine out just to sort of see, because it really is a great shooting gun, and I think the extra weight would then offset all of the other negative things I've had to say, is that when you're specifically using those extra hot modern loads, this was, neither of the guns were designed for them, but this gun does not like them, and you can break receivers using them. The Model 50, you're not going to run into that problem. So there's a little bit of a, my thoughts on these things as a modern hunting implement. Obviously fine for lead and for bismuth and for copper, you're not going to have problems. But with use with steel shot, there's nothing here that would really scare me that much, assuming you're at mod choke or less. So there's my thoughts on that. However, to wrap things up, I would like to say that while I don't think these things are perfect by any stretch, I do think that the Model 59 specifically is the best shotgun that Winchester has ever made. Now, there can be room for debate for this, and you can tell me I'm wrong in the comments, but the Winchester Super X4 is probably the next nearest thing, but I don't know if I consider that a shotgun Winchester made, because it's sort of a Browning FN Group designed gun that Winchester's name is on. And then maybe you can look back to the Super X1 to say it's sort of similar, but not in a way that explicitly matters. And the Super X1 kind of bankrupted Winchester because it was too nice a gun for them to be able to manufacture in terms of the overall finish of the gun. In terms of how it works, it's a little hit and miss and a little fragile. But I'm sort of beating around the bush to say, I think that this is the best gun they made, mostly because it was so forward-looking. I think the fiberglass barrel is extremely smart. I think that this could be on many more modern shotguns. I think the action is cool. I don't necessarily think that that's ahead of its time, but the use of alloy receivers, and the barrel's way ahead of its time, but the use of an alloy receiver here to make a lightweight, but not too lightweight hunting gun, it makes a lot of sense. If you sort of fast forward and look at what Beretta has done with their latest AX800, it's a 3-shot dedicated hunting gun that uses a lightweight, and they're using polymer, but a lightweight receiver material. Like, look at what Beretta's doing there compared to what Winchester did here. It's very similar in concept, slightly different in the action and the way they work is obviously different, but I think it's a similar sort of thing, and I think the AX800 is an interesting idea. The same way I think that this was a way interesting, way forward-thinking idea. And as a result of that, and plus just the way the gun shoots and handles, and I've shot multiple examples besides these two, to really cement my opinion, I think the 59 was the best gun that Winchester ever made. At the very least, it is the best automatic. You guys can argue with me about the side-by-sides. I've held a 21 and I've shot a 24. I don't have a lot of experience with the side-by-sides, but I kind of think side-by-sides sort of automatically put themselves out of the running for the best gun a company makes if they've made something besides a side-by-side, which isn't to say side-by-sides aren't cool, it's just that they're not that good. Winchester didn't make their own. The 101s were made in Olin Cadencia, so I don't think that technically qualifies as Winchester making them. And even still, I don't think that they're that good. I think this gun is that good, while at the same time understanding that it's not great, but it is that good. And if we compare it to Winchester's other automatics, maybe the only one that comes close is the Super X1 or the Super X4, but we've already explained Super X1 wasn't that good. It's sort of a rose-tinted glasses thing. The Super X4 isn't exactly a Winchester product, so it's hard to say. At the very least, looking at the real Winchester era, when Winchester made Winchester guns, and Winchester designed Winchester guns, and Winchester made the guns they designed, I think this wins out, especially in the automatic category, because you're looking at the Winchester 1911, which was a flop and is weird, and looking at the Winchester Model 40. which had it had so much going for it, but design and quality control were out the window, and so the gun was a bust before it ever had a chance. So all of this rambling aside, there's my opinion. That's what I'll close on, is I think this is the best shotgun that Winchester ever made, with the qualifier that they did actually make it and they did actually design it. Of course, there's other guns that might throw wrenches in the work if you look at stuff that Winchester bought from other companies or branded from other companies. But there's my closing thoughts. Let me know what you guys think about that down in the description. If you've shot one, or you've got one like it, or you're interested in picking one up, or you do pick one up, then you want to let me know how stupid I was based off of saying this is the best gun Winchester's ever made, go ahead and let me know. But I think these are great. I think that they're not perfect, but in their own right, it's still a really, really cool gun. With that, I will go ahead and end things. I hope that you guys have enjoyed the video and enjoyed the look at this shotgun, an underappreciated shotgun. Again, I'm still going to keep harping on this, but I hope you guys have enjoyed the look. You're free to let me know in the comments how stupid I am and how the Le Reddit Hecking Warbang Trench Pump Shot Scatter Gun Slammer is actually the best shotgun Winchester made. You'd be completely wrong, and that's utterly indefensible, but you can say it anyway in the comment to boost the engagement. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. I hope you guys have been enjoying the videos. We've got more interesting shotguns coming soon, like a lot more interesting shotguns, and some like really, really, really interesting shotguns that are coming here pretty soon. So I hope you guys stay tuned for that. If you enjoy that sort of content or the other sorts of content, of course, I've got a Patreon in the description, so between the video and the section where you tell me how the Model 12 is the best shotgun ever made and I roll my eyes and have to resist the urge to call you stupid on the internet, there's a section that's called the description, and in the description you can find a link to the Patreon. And support with the Patreon is always greatly appreciated, because it's the support with the Patreon that helps keep me feeding these weird shotguns ammo so that I can break them, so that I can fix them, so that I can shoot them, so that I can talk about them and complain about them. And with that, we'll go ahead and leave it there. I will see you guys next time, where we'll be looking at something else that may be wildly cool or may just be sort of interesting, but it's always a good time.